I think we're ready to start. We're going to start just a couple of minutes early. It seems like everybody's here. So for our second to the last of the day, we've got Ava. She's got a great topic. It's one that is interesting to me as a biologist, and as also as just a tourism in the world and seeing the amounts of plastic everywhere. And so her title is The Smallest Course on the Menu, Setting a Standard for Allowable Microplastic Content in Food Market Goods. Let me read her acknowledgments. She says, I would like to thank God, my foundation and stronghold throughout my life, and especially through this thesis process. For the wisdom he has graciously given me, I am endlessly grateful. To my family, thank you for your unwavering love and support, especially to my mom, who was the greatest inspiration behind the topic I chose. To my friends, thank you for making this thesis journey bearable and somewhat enjoyable. Somewhat. To Mr. Wade, whose patience, particularly in grading all of our late work, has been nothing short of extraordinary. To my advisor, Ms. Bea, thank you for your thoughtful guidance and insights, and to all the teachers who lent their knowledge and expertise in support of this thesis. Finally, to my panelists, Ms. Monique and Mr. Christian, thank you for your time. I hope we have a meaningful discussion. Once again, her title is The Smallest Course on the Menu, Setting a Standard for Allowable Microplastic Content in Food Market Goods. Give me about 2 seconds, and then I'll set the timer up and tell you when you can start.
Okay.
All right, you can start when ready.
Imagine eating a credit card. Funny? Well, I'm here to tell you that you already have. Research conducted by the University of Newcastle found that on average, every week, people approximately indigest 5 grams of plastic particles, which is equivalent to the plastics in a credit card. Shocking, right? None of us would ever realize it. This plastic don't appear as visible chunks, they exist as microplastic. Plastic particles so small that the human naked eye can't see. They infiltrate our air, our food, and just about everything. So while we may laugh at the idea of eating plastic, the reality is that these particles have already entered our body every single day. The concerning fact is that there is still no regulations on it. No one is doing anything about it. How much of it should we really be allowed to consume? The production of plastic dates back to the mid-19th century, when scientists sought new ways to make synthetic polymer, now known as plastics. The first person to do so was Leo Blakeland in 1907. Plastic became so widespread due to its versatility and durability. In 1993, marine scientist Richard Thomson discovered small plastic materials, which he then called microplastics, while he and his students were surveying a beach. His discovery fueled other discoveries and research about the harmful effect of microplastic to human health, especially because the number of plastic production keeps on increasing, from just 1.5 million metric tons in 1950 to over 442.5 million metric tons of plastic material produced in 2023. Furthermore, among this large number of plastic material, only 9% of the entire plastic waste gets recycled, leaving more than 90% disposed in landfills or burnt in incinerators. As a result, microplastics are now found everywhere, as they are formed by the breakdown of larger plastic items. Research estimated that in our ocean alone, there are 24.4 trillion pieces of microplastic, with the figure predicted to keep on increasing. Consequently, humans are increasingly exposed to microplastics. Study estimates that 39,000 to 52,000 microplastic particles are inhaled by people every day. Due to its small size, they are small enough to infiltrate water filtration system, contaminating food and water sources. Despite it all, till this date, there is still no universally accepted definition of microplastic. But one widely spread definition by the United Nations Environment Programme defines microplastic as any plastic material ranging from the size of 1 micrometer to 5 millimeter. There are 2 types of microplastic, primary and secondary. Primary microplastics are manufactured plastic with size less than 5 millimeter, while secondary microplastics are microplastic caused by the disintegration of larger plastic items like water bottles and fishing nets. Given their infiltration to the food sources, the issue of microplastic is no longer purely scientific. It has become an ethical and moral concern. However, no organization has established universal standard or enforceable limits of its contamination in food. Debate has emerged whether it is even needed due to uncertainties and technical challenges. Despite it all, authorities must establish a strict standard for allowable microplastic content in food market goods before they are allowed to be marketed and distributed to consumers, for 3 reasons. First, to protect human health. Second, to protect the environment. And third, as a way of honoring God and exercising stewardship. First, regulation on microplastics are needed to protect human health, as microplastic poses a serious threat to the human body. As the number of microplastic increases, human exposure to inhalation, indigestion, and skin contact also rises. Recent studies have emerged confirming that microplastics are found in multiple human organs. For one reason, microplastic disrupts the digestive system. With the widespread consumption of fast food and plastic packaged goods, microplastic comes into our body and affects nearly every single digestive organ. The damage begins in the oral cavity, where microplastic alters the oral microbiome and destroys the oral mucosa. Studies show that individuals with higher exposure levels exhibit elevated oribacterium level, making them more prone to cough and pharyngitis. Microplastic then travels to the esophagus, where they disrupt its protective lining and carry toxic substances into the body. Over time, they accumulate in the gut and alter the gut bacteria, resulting in chronic inflammation, reduced absorption, and an increased vulnerability to digestive diseases. In a study, Democritus says, if you have an inflammation, it makes the gut leakier. This means that an increased intestinal permeability makes toxic substances easier to enter the body. It does not only lead to digestive complications like bowel disease, but also to asthma and allergies and other autoimmune disorders. Aside from the digestive system, microplastic negatively impacts the immune system. Since the innate immune system is the first line of defense and is triggered when they find a foreign object, when microplastic enters the body, it triggers a non-specific immune response that often leads to cellular damage. As the neutrophil attempts to engulf the microplastic, this process becomes self-destructive. Instead of neutralizing the particle, the neutrophil themselves undergo rapid cell death due to the toxicity and physical rigidity of this particle. This severely disrupts the effectiveness of immune surveillance and weakens overall immunity. Another very complex and long-lasting form of immune-disrupting microplastic is what is called trained innate immunity. This phenomenon occurs when innate immune cells become reprogrammed after exposure to harmful particles, leaving them hyperreactive and producing excessive inflammation even in response to mild stimuli. Research shows that pristine graphene particles used as model for microplastic material can reprogram macrophages to induce innate immunity memory. This suggests that once the body is exposed to microplastic, cells may remain chronically overreactive, releasing excessive inflammation even in situations where a normal system would remain stable. Last, microplastic affects and damages our respiratory system. Because inhalation is one of the primary routes of microplastic exposure, it is nearly unavoidable that these particles enters our lung due to its small size. A study by Luis Fernando examined 20 pulmonary tissues of non-smoking adults and found microplastics such as polyethylene and polypropylene were present in these tissues. They trigger inflammation and oxidative stress, damaging lung tissues that often leads to coughing, wheezing, and other diseases like asthma and pneumonia. These findings demonstrate that microplastic affects our entire body system, and thus implementing a microplastic regulation on food market goods would decrease its exposure to human health and ultimately improving human health. The second reason why a microplastic regulation is needed is that it will significantly protect the environment. First, regulation would increase public awareness of the harmful effects of microplastic and motivate behavioral change. Even with the amount of information on the internet, majority of people still are not knowledgeable about this microplastic issue. Recent studies have shown that people have heard the term microplastic, yet they lack knowledge about its harmful effects. This is where authority intervention becomes crucial. A study in China demonstrates the influential role of government regulation in shaping environmental outcomes. They found that when government attention increased significantly, it caused the strongest positive effect on the Sustainable Development Goals progress. When government interfere, public norms shift accordingly, increasing awareness of the microplastic environmental harm and encouraging more environmentally friendly product design. Second, microplastic regulation would compel industries to shift towards environmentally friendly product design. If a strict regulation is set, industries must adjust to it and decrease their use of plastic material for their products. A relevant example is the European Union's regulation in banning intentionally added microplastics for cosmetic goods, which has encouraged manufacturers to reformulate products and explore alternative substitutes, such as using minerals, wax, cellulose capsules to replace these plastic particles. The packaging industry presents an even greater urgency. Packaging alone accounts for 40% of the world's global waste and is the leading source of microplastic contamination in food caused by migration through heat and mechanical stress. Without regulation, industries would have no incentive to change. But with enforced standards, companies would be required to adopt safer alternatives like using biodegradable packaging made from polyhydroxyalkanoates or PHA, edible film like chitosan, or even natural fibers like cellulose and bamboo. Third, preventing microplastic pollution is more effective than ecosystem cleanup. A study by Schmaltz identified 52 technologies for plastic pollution, yet only 14 are preventive technologies. This shows a global bias towards reacting to the pollution instead of stopping it at its source. While cleanup technologies like filtration system or wastewater treatment exist, they can only achieve 90% removal efficiency, are limited in scale, and can target microplastics specifically. From an economic viewpoint, prevention is also far more cost-effective. Once microplastics are released to the environment, cleanup cannot undo the biological damage it has already done. Preventive policies, on the other hand, stop pollution before it enters the environment entirely, reducing the burden on ecosystem at the source. While cleanup initiatives remain important as supplementary measures, they cannot function as the sole solution to microplastic pollution and are insufficient without preventive regulations. The third and final reason is that setting a microplastic regulation is a way of honoring God and exercising stewardship. First, it fulfills humanity's God-driven mandate to steward creation. From the beginning, the Bible has already presented humans as caretakers of God's creation. Just as it states in Genesis 2 verse 15 and Genesis 1 verse 26 to 28, God grants human authority to rule over creation, not as an oppressive rule, but as a command to protect it. Humans' mandate was and is to care for the environment. Yet today, the very environment entrusted to us is being polluted by human negligence. Our oceans are contaminated, wildlife is harmed, and even the food that we eat today are exposed to microplastics. Failing to address this environmental harm contradicts the mandate that God has already entrusted us with. By advocating for regulations, we are not exercising control for selfish gain, but fulfilling God's command and humans' mandate as caretakers. Second, regulating microplastic content honors God by protecting the human body, the temple of God. In 1 Corinthians 6, verse 19 to 20, Apostle Paul writes that our body are temple of the Holy Spirit, and therefore must be honored as belongings of God rather than ourselves. Just like the temple in the Old Testament, our sacred spaces meticulously built and designed for God's presence, we too must be intentional about what we allow into our bodies. 3 John 1, verse 2 affirms this further. God desires not only our spiritual well being, but our physical health as well. With this knowledge, hence, advocating microplastic regulation is not just a public health decision, but a moral responsibility aligned with Scripture. Third, ignoring the microplastic pollution despite knowing its harm is a sin of ignorance. James 4, verse 17 states, "If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and does not do it, it is a sin for them." This verse means that sin is not only doing what is wrong, but it also includes failing to act when the right course of action is known. In the context of environmental harm, scientific issue has clearly demonstrated that microplastic poses risk to both human health and the ecosystem. With this knowledge, ignoring the problem or delaying action reflects the kind of ignorance Scripture warns. Certainly, microplastic regulation is not the easiest regulation to be set, requiring a lot of financial investment, technological development, and political effort. However, just like James says, that difficulty does not excuse inaction. However, there are some that might argue that implementing a microplastic regulation would increase prices of food market goods. Their concern is that enforcing a regulation would require companies to purchase new tracking equipment to track the amount of microplastic is in their product, thus increasing prices. However, when these costs are compared with the long-term effect it has on both the ecosystem and human health, the argument becomes less convincing. The Lancet estimates that the global health burden attributable to microplastic exposure accounts to no less than $1.5 trillion annually, driven by the presence of over 16,000 chemicals present in the plastic that interfere with the human bodily functions. This figure significantly outweighs the cost of microplastic detection technology, which have become increasingly economical, with recent advancement reducing costs up to 75%. Others might also argue that microplastics are not yet proven harmful enough to warrant regulation. They emphasize that scientific understanding of their health effect is still developing. This is partially true. Research is still ongoing, and not yet every risk has been fully yet quantified. However, scientific uncertainty cannot excuse inaction. Microplastics are already identified in the brain, heart, testicles, and even in newborns. Stanford physician Daisy Librot states, "We are born pre-polluted. This means exposure begins before birth. Waiting for absolute proof risks allowing greater and potentially irreversible harm. Acting early is always better than waiting until harm becomes undeniable." Throughout this thesis, we have explored reasons why authority must establish a strict standard for allowable microplastic content in food market goods, from the health consequences it poses to the environmental impact on microplastic pollution, and our biblical perspective as stewards of God's creation. In the beginning of this thesis, I asked you all to imagine eating a credit card. But perhaps now the question is this: how many more credit cards are we willing to consume before we decide enough is enough? Without strict regulation, this issue will continue to grow. Microplastic would continue to accumulate in our oceans, our food, and even in our own bodies. Authorities must act quickly. But while creating regulation might be the responsibility of those in power, change must also begin with us. We might all know the traditional 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. But here today, I want to present you with a new set of 3 R's. First, replace. Replace your plastic bottles using safer alternatives like glass or stainless steel. Second, refuse. Refuse to heat up your food using plastic. Refuse to leave plastic water bottles under the sun. Third, rethink. Rethink our dependence on single-use plastic. Rethink a lifestyle where we prioritize sustainability instead of convenience. Let us replace, refuse, and rethink. Thank you.
Good job, Ava. Do you need a drink of water? You can go ahead and get a drink if you need one. Great job, Ava. Our panelists today are Miss Monique
you.
and Mr. Christian. Let me let Miss Monique go first.
Yeah, good job, Eva. And when I heard your confident oration just now, I bet that you did your homework very well, with the research and the data. Let me start it with the first one. So let us start from the biblical point of view, yeah? You argue that failing to regulate microplastic is such a sin under James 4, verse 17, right? It's a part of failure of stewardship. Did you say that, right?
Yes, it's a part of stewardship, but it's also a sin of ignorance.
Sin of ignorance. And then, do you think as a customer, we put that burden of sin? What do you think about it?
Okay. Thank you for the question, Miss.
Yeah.
So I think because I'm arguing that even though we as consumers, we might not be the one who create the regulation, but for example, we're consuming all these microplastics and we know that this microplastic enters our body. So in a way, it's a sin of ignorance because we're basically like ignoring that these microplastics are going inside our body and we just neglect that this problem actually exists. So it's a sin of ignorance for us consumers as well.
Okay. Is there any room where we can say for the customer, we don't have many options to do something?
Thank you for your question. I think we have an option as customers because the use of plastic, even though we can see it's everywhere, but we can, as I already said in my call to action, we can replace our plastic bottles using stainless steel or glass, or even we can change our culture, even though it might be hard. But for example, we go to a warung, for example, and then they give us using plastic containers. We can instead bring our own containers, then foster this culture where we bring our own containers rather than using the single-use plastics that will just be disposed in landfills.
Okay. Do you do that lifestyle nowadays?
Thank you for your question, Miss.
No, I'm just asking.
yeah, okay. I think for now, because while I was doing this research, my mind is now more open towards the amount of plastic and how harmful it is to plastic. So now I am more aware, especially when buying like plastic bottles. I don't buy plastic bottles anymore. Instead, I bring my own water bottles.
Oh, okay, yeah. No worries, yeah. The previous question will not deduct any grades. Yeah. Okay, may I continue?
Yes.
So, as let's say consumer,
Okay.
can replace like what you explained before, replace the plastic with the stainless steel, right? So some of the people already got aware about that, but then let's say if you have the opportunity to be the one that can make a regulation, how do you prevent the greenwashing before where companies or market products as eco-friendly or microplastic free, to charge a premium price when in reality the product still lines shed with the synthetic polymers? What do you think about it?
Sorry, Miss, to rephrase your question.
Oh,
To what are you asking is like, what can we say to like the companies that basically false like hope or like stuff?
Or probably
what's your question again, Miss? Sorry.
yeah, it's okay. So if you have a chance to be the one that can make a regulation, how you are going to prevent the greenwashing where the companies, will use in the name of microplastic free, and then charge a premium price but then actually it's not like really as premium as what they say.
Okay.
So what do you think about something you can do to
Okay.
avoid that situation?
I think, okay, I think if I'm in that position and I have that power, I would have like annual like checkups for these companies. Like maybe it's like every 6 months, every 3 months, where I reevaluate the products they're actually using to make sure that the products that they use is actually what they say it is.
Yeah, because I'm thinking that you have a care to think that how we are going to protect our consumers from the deceptive marketers, right? But then at the same time, also as a country,
Yeah.
we need to have actually that you have said in the very beginning of your paper, we need to have a institution that really put the label with the integrity. Do you think in Indonesia we have that institution that already tried to put that label with the integrity when the company says this is microplastic free? What do you think?
Okay, thank you for the question, Miss. I think, okay, to clarify, like I don't think a plastic will be possible to be it's microplastic free, since if it's a plastic like packaging, it will already have microplastic since it's plastic. But I think for the like the authority to have the one that has the has this power, it would be okay. Maybe it's not really strictly implemented because I think there's a lot of loopholes, especially in Indonesia. But I think it's the BPOM, since they're the one that's regulating all of this regulations for food and all the chemicals and everything that's present in the food. Yeah.
Okay, so at least in Indonesia we have something
Yeah.
to start with.
At least.
Okay, Mr. Wade, do I still have time?
Have time if you want to use it, or you can hand it over to Mr. Christian.
A little bit more. One more question.
Okay.
Yeah. So if a country like Indonesia, yeah, implements, let's say, strict microplastic limits, yeah, in all market goods, and then don't you think which sides that will feel that most burden when we try to implement that microplastic limits in Indonesia?
I thank you for the question, Miss. I think the most that's going to be affected is the plastic manufacturers, since if we decrease the amount of microplastic in a certain packaging, then companies would try to find other alternatives, and most likely they're not going to use plastics, and that so the plastic industries would have a decrease in demand, and that would impact the companies. But I think that this issue cannot hinder us from actually implementing this regulation, since the amount of plastic produced is going in an uptrend scale, and if we keep on producing the amount of plastic we are today, it was gonna cause so much harm to the environment.
Well said. Thank you, Ava. Go ahead, Mr. Christian.
All right, hello, Alpha, and thank you for bringing to light basically an issue that has been quite, pretty much it's actually been quite popular or like commonly heard in online about the fact that there's a whole lot of microplastics in our body at the moment, which is kind of a bit of a harrowing issue or in some ways, but yeah, I also appreciate the fact that you also emphasize about the regulation, the science behind it, as well as the biblical principle behind it. So it's a rather well done thesis overall.
Sir.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so maybe let's go with the questions. And honestly, I'm gonna be a bit more technical in terms of
Okay.
your proposal here.
Okay.
So for the first part, you have mentioned and proposed that companies should regulate the amount of microplastics in their products, especially related to food products, right? Now, you have also mentioned that there are ways for us to check the content of microplastic in a certain packaging or food, as well as in that regard. So, can you explain? Have you maybe researched or Can you explain for the general audience how exactly is that done, really?
Okay.
Because you have mentioned, and we are aware that microplastics cannot be seen by the naked eye. So how exactly are they detected in the first place?
Okay, thank you, Mr. for your problem question. Question. I mean, wait, sorry. Okay, thank you, Mr. for the question. Based on my research, the most like common way of detecting microplastic is what it's called FTIR uh, machines. Basically, that these machines will detect the microplastic microscopically, and when they detect it, the microplastic will glow it will glow like in the screen. So basically, it's called an FTIR machine, or another one is Raman spectroscopy, which is also another way of detecting microplastic. And especially now with AI, they are able to implement AI into these machines, in which rather than calculating the amount of microplastic in a certain item by like humans themselves, they can use AI to calculate the amount of microplastic, which will significantly, yeah, decrease the time to count the amount of microplastic in a certain item.
Okay, I see. So that's probably a better implementation of AI instead of having someone literally count small pieces of
Yes.
plastic
Yes, it
in the
will be
general
there.
area. All right.
Yep.
Now, of course, that is definitely useful in terms of the funding or the need for that. Well, if you're implementing this regulation, then definitely companies will have to, or at least there has to be institutions that are specializing in this kind of checks, right? Are these machines generally accessible to the everyday corporations or even like small businesses in that regard?
Uh, Thank you for the question. I think, especially in Europe, based on my research, in Europe, there's a lot of like places where they actually have microplastic research. But in Indonesia and in Indonesia especially, I think those technologies and those machines are still very much preliminary. I haven't found an exact source where there's microplastic research in Indonesia using this type of machines, but elsewhere, I have seen, and there's a lot of research in other places of the world.
Okay, maybe don't swear in that regard, but yeah. Okay. Right. Thank you for that answer, and thank you for the explanation in that regard. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe going with the general lines of this discussion at the moment. Now, obviously, in many cases, you can, like in places like Europe and similar, the quality of pollution around those regions are typically rather excellent. In other words, there's barely any pollution around, and that might also include the fact of the concentration of microplastics. However, if we compare that to here in Indonesia, the story tells a different tale, right? Now, in that regard, perhaps the better way to tackle the issue is also maybe filtering that. Like, is that even something possible with the current technology that is available? Filtering microplastics from food packaging or any food processes around us?
Thank you for your question, Mister. Based on my research, I have not found a specific machine to filter the amount of microplastic content in a certain food product. However, if you're talking about oceans or other places, there's already some machines that are able to do so. So I think in the future, if this issue keeps on growing, and I think it will keep on growing, technology will advance and more technologies will be able to actually filter this microplastics in food.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I suppose we can only hope for the
Yeah.
development for now. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Maybe I'm also kind of curious about the technicalities here, because if you're thinking about plastics, it's actually quite a diverse category of material. There are plastics that are used in electrical appliances. There are plastics that are used for industrial purposes and covers. Then there's also the type of plastic that are labeled and scrutinized as food grade.
Yeah.
Right? Those are usually what comes as Tupperwares and plastic packaging and so on. Those that are supposedly safe to be used as for their intended function. Now, in that case, are those types of plastic also one of the causes for the microplastic pollution in that regard?
Thank you for the question, Mister. I think yes, because based on my research, like even wooden cutting boards, like they're obviously food grade since we used to chop them, they can already release microplastics. So, with that said, that I think that food containers also would release microplastics, especially if we, for example, we microwave them. Study shows that millions of microplastics are released when we heat up plastics, and yeah.
Oh, and that also applies to plastics that are labeled as microwave safe then?
Yes, based on my research, even plastics that are labeled microwave safe, they still release these particles.
Oh, goodness,
Yeah.
okay. So I guess
So-
that's why you're taking this
Yeah,
thesis,
so
because...
yeah, I think the best way is to actually just replace or we just refuse to, especially microwave plastic. We just use ceramics or glass or other things that we can use instead
Oh.
of plastics.
All right, nice, okay. So that's where the strong stance has come from. Do I still
Yes.
have time for? All right, let's go along with your proposed solution. Now, obviously, yes, historically, companies began with packaging that was glass-based, let's be honest, as well as metal-based.
Yep.
But the moment plastic was invented and produced, that's when essentially they ended up utilizing it to a significant extent, right? And that's also, well, that's also because of a few advantages that plastic production has over glass and metal, which is usually about the cost.
The cost.
It's literally dirt cheap in order to produce plastic packaging compared to trying to use glass and metal, and that also includes their disposal technically. So, if we were to put that kind of regulation, is that something feasible to be done, especially in our current economical trend and world in that regard?
Thank you for the question, Mister. I think that yes, it will have an economic impact since we have to deviate from using plastics and the cost will increase. However, I think I would like to emphasize in the reduce of single-use plastics, like for plastic packaging. It's plastics that we only eat the product for maybe 1 minute, 5 minutes, but this packaging would be disposed and it will take years maybe to actually disintegrate and be recycled. So I would like to foster maybe a new culture. Maybe if we go to a supermarket, especially in the U.S., there's already what it's called zero waste supermarkets, in which supermarkets, instead of having packaging for certain types of food items, they actually bring their own containers, like their jars, and it's like a sort of like a dispenser method where you put your own the things that you want to buy in jars and you purchase them. So in that way, you don't need to use plastic packaging.
Yeah, that's actually quite a movement that has
Yeah.
occurred. Even in Indonesia, there have been stores that does that as well. Although perhaps, if we're being really honest, it's really down to the diligence of the individual, and many times those kinds of stores don't really survive compared to the convenience of everything else, right? Yeah, but all of what you're saying so far has been harrowingly fair points, if anything, right? Now, maybe I want to kind of mention the biological aspect a little bit in this kind of regard, although I'm not that versed in biology, if I apologize for that. Now, essentially, it's quite unavoidable that we already have microplastics inside of us, and we accidentally or unknowingly consume microplastics at a regular basis, right? But, well, if we're being really honest, the human body is quite wondrous in many regards as well, and that includes our digestive system. So is that not enough to kind of mitigate the plastic that has entered into our system in that regard?
Thank you for the question, Mister. So yes, I think God has already created our body in marvelous ways in which we can actually flush this microplastics out of our body. But that does not every single microplastic is flushed out of our body. Research shows that, again, microplastics are found in our heart, in our brains, and even in our lungs. And this microplastic, they not only they not only pass through our body, but they accumulate. Like research shows that in studies of identifying microplastic in like 2 different brains, one in 2016 and one in 2024, they found that there's an increase in 50% of microplastic material in the brain, which shows that this plastic actually accumulates over time.
Okay, that does sound quite bad, doesn't it? All right.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's enough for a question, so I think I'll just stop it here. Good job overall, Avalon.
Okay,
Mr.
I'll ask one question.
Okay.
So you mentioned neutrophils, and neutrophils are part of the immune system, and they're actually white blood cells that engulf foreign particles and try to destroy them. And they typically die after doing that. And so you talked about the destruction of neutrophils. And my question is, are they successful? When a neutrophil engulfs a particle of microplastic, is it successful in breaking it down in order to remove it from our body, or is it not?
Okay. Thank you for the question, Mr. Wade. I watched a YouTube video in the morning, and it shows that scientific research has actually already tried that. Like they actually like feed neutrophils microplastic, and over time, instead of killing the microplastic or actually engulfing it, they just engulf it, and the microplastic still stays in their cells. So it means that they don't actually kill the microplastic.
Wow, that is really good information. I'm glad you looked at that because I was genuinely curious. I didn't know. Okay, thank you, Ava. Your time is up. You've done a great job.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Miss. Thank you, Miss. Thank you, Miss. Thank you, Mr.